You won't be joining us, Mom. My wife prefers to keep family gatherings smaller. The words, stark and cold, still echoed in the quiet corners of my mind, even years later. A single text message. That's how my own son, the boy I'd carried, nurtured, and sacrificed everything for, cut me out. Just like that. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly fathom, was the quiet ocean of secrets I held within me. Secrets that would eventually ripple through their carefully constructed lives. Grandma? What's wrong? Marietta, my sweet little firefly, squeezed my hand, her small fingers surprisingly strong around my own, gnarled with age and etched with the stories of a lifetime. The fading evening light, filtered through the delicate lace curtains I'd inherited from my own grandmother, cast long dancing shadows across the wooden floorboards of my living room. The air was thick with the scent of simmering chamomile, tea, and the comforting, earthy aroma of worn wood and old paperbacks. My sanctuary. My haven. I blinked, pulling myself back from the precipice of that memory, and offered her a wobbly smile. Nothing, my love, just thinking. I tightened, my grip on her hand, running a thumb over her soft skin. Sometimes, memories have a way of sneaking up on you, don't they? Marietta, all of 8 years old and sharp as a tack, nodded sagely. Her wide, innocent eyes, the color of warm honey, searched mine with an earnestness that always disarmed me. Are they happy memories, Grandma? I chuckled, a sound that felt rusty in my throat. Some are, and some are lessons, little one. Hard-won lessons. I paused, stroking her wispy brown hair. Would you like to hear a story, my firefly? A real story. About a time long, long ago when Grandma was just a little girl, not much older than you? Her eyes lit up. Oh, yes, please, Grandma. Tell me everything. She snuggled closer on the worn velvet settee, her head resting against my shoulder, a small, comforting weight. The warmth of her presence was a balm to old wounds. Well, I began, my voice soft, almost a whisper, as if sharing a sacred secret. It all started in a place very different from here. Not California, but a small village nestled in the heart of the Midwest, where the winds howled like hungry wolves in winter and the summers were so hot you could almost see the air shimmer. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the memories wash over me, vibrant and raw, as if they'd happened yesterday. Flashback. The year is 1948. A young Alara, barely 10, stands barefoot in a dusty field, the sun beating down mercilessly on her straw hat. Her small hands grip a worn hoe, the wood smooth from years of use. Sweat trickles down her temples, stinging her eyes, but she doesn't dare stop. Not with Pa's eyes on her, stern and unyielding, from the porch of their run-down farmhouse. The air is thick with the scent of rich earth and the distant lowing of cattle. A storm is brewing, the sky darkening ominously on the horizon, mirroring the turmoil in her young heart. My family wasn't rich, Marietta. Not by a long shot. We were farmers, tilling the same stubborn land our ancestors had worked for generations. Every sunrise brought with it the promise of back-breaking labor, and every sunset, the ache of exhaustion in our bones. We didn't have much, but we had each other, or so I thought. My mother, bless her gentle soul, was a quiet woman, her hands always busy, her heart always worried. She smelled of freshly baked bread and lavender, and her lullabies could soothe any fear. My father, though, Pa, was a different sort, hard as nails and twice as unyielding. He believed in work and little else. Love was a luxury, a weakness even in his eyes. He loved the land more than anything, more than us, his own flesh and blood. And he had a particular fondness for my older brother, Thomas. Even now, his name tastes like ash in my mouth. He was everything Pa wanted in a son, strong, boisterous, and seemingly destined to inherit the farm. I, on the other hand, was just Alara, the girl. Good for helping Ma in the kitchen, for mending clothes, for weeding the endless rows of corn, but never for the farm. Girls don't understand the land, Alara, Pa would grunt, dismissing me with a wave of his hand whenever I tried to offer an opinion on the planting schedule or the health of the livestock. That's Thomas's domain. Flashback, Alara, 13 now, watches Thomas, 15, effortlessly guide the plow through the soil, a confident smirk on his face. She feels a pang of something she can't quite name, envy, resentment, as Pa claps Thomas on the shoulder, a rare, almost tender gesture. Alara, meanwhile, is inside, kneading dough, the rhythmic thud of her fists against the floury board mirroring the frustration in her chest. She secretly devoured books, hiding them under her mattress, dreaming of a world beyond the dusty fields and the endless chores. A world where she could learn, explore, and be more than just the girl. The seeds of betrayal, Marietta, they're often sown long before they blossom into full-blown thorns. Sometimes they're planted in the subtle slights, the unspoken preferences, the quiet dismissal of one child over another. I loved Thomas in my own way. He was my brother, my only sibling. But even then, I sensed a chasm widening between us, built on Pa's favoritism and Thomas's growing sense of entitlement. Our farm, though modest, held a deep secret, a secret that Pa guarded fiercely. He often disappeared into the dense woods behind our property, sometimes for hours, returning with a glint in his eye and a satisfied set to his jaw. He never spoke of what he did there, only muttering about checking the traps or scouting for timber. But I was a curious child, always peeking, always observing. One sweltering afternoon, when the cicadas buzzed a droning symphony and the air hung heavy and still, Pa was gone longer than usual. Ma was napping, exhausted from canning the summer's bounty. Thomas was off fishing in the creek, lost in his own world. I, however, felt an inexplicable pull towards the woods. A child's intuition, perhaps, or destiny, gently nudging me along its path. I slipped out of the house, my heart thumping a quick rhythm against my ribs. The woods were darker, cooler, a welcome respite from the oppressive heat. The scent of pine needles and damp earth filled my nostrils. I pushed through tangled undergrowth, ignoring the scratches on my bare arms and legs, following a faint, almost imperceptible trail Pa often took. And then I saw it. Not Pa, but a small, unassuming mound of earth, cleverly camouflaged by fallen leaves and branches. It looked like a natural rise in the ground, but something about its precision, its deliberate concealment, caught my eye. My curiosity, a constant companion throughout my childhood, overcame my ingrained fear of Pa's wrath. I knelt, pushing away the leaves, and found a rough-hewn wooden lid. My fingers trembled as I lifted it. Inside, nestled amongst layers of oilskin and canvas, were not traps or timber, but a collection of old, tarnished metal boxes. And in one of them, gleaming faintly in the dappled sunlight, was a single, raw gold nugget, the size of my thumb, and beside it, a stack of crisp, clean banknotes bound with a twine. It wasn't a fortune, not yet, but it was more money than I'd ever seen in my life. My breath caught in my throat. Gold, money, hidden. What was this? Why was Pa hiding it? And from whom? The questions tumbled in my mind, a chaotic mess of wonder and unease. Before I could process it all, I heard a twig snap behind me. My blood ran cold. Flashback, Ilara whirls around, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing there, just a few feet away, is Thomas, his eyes wide, fixed not on her, but on the open cache, the gold. Nuggets shimmering in the dim light. A slow, knowing smile spreads across his face, a smile that sends a shiver down Ilara's spine. The storm clouds that had been gathering all afternoon finally unleashed their fury, a sudden downpour drenching the woods, mirroring the tempest brewing between the two siblings. He didn't say a word, just that smile, that unsettling, predatory smile. He knew. He'd seen. And in that moment, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that our lives and the fragile peace of our family would never be the same again. This hidden treasure, this secret that should have brought us security, had instead become a silent wedge driven deep between us. It was the first crack in the foundation, Marietta, the first tremor of a betrayal that would echo through decades. What would Thomas do with this knowledge? Would he tell Pa? Or would he, like me, keep it a secret, a weapon to be wielded at the opportune moment? The rain poured down, blurring the edges of the forest, blurring the edges of my young, innocent world. I just stood there, soaked to the bone, staring at my brother, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The gold, meant to be a silent promise of a better future, had instead become a harbinger of a darker one. Little did I know, Marietta, that this discovery was merely the prologue to a much grander, more agonizing tale of deception and resilience. The true story of my life, the one where I was cut out, disregarded, and ultimately underestimated, was only just beginning. What do you think happened next, my firefly? Did Thomas keep our secret, or did he betray me, even then? But what did he do, Grandma? Did he tell on you? Marietta's voice was a small, anxious whisper, pulling me from the rain-soaked memory of the woods. She had shifted on the settee, her little body tense, her honey-colored eyes wide with the gravity of a secret shared. I could see the cogs turning in her clever mind, imagining the shouting, the punishment, the fallout of a childhood. Crime. The truth, however, was so much quieter, and in its silence, infinitely more corrosive. I drew a slow, deliberate breath, the scent of chamomile and old books filling my lungs, grounding me in the now. "No, my firefly," I said, my voice barely audible over the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "He didn't tell. He did something far worse." Marietta's brow furrowed in confusion. "Worse than telling?" "Oh, yes," I confirmed, stroking her hair. "He did nothing. He said nothing. He just held it. He let the secret hang between us, a ghost that only we could see." From that day forward, the knowledge became his currency, his power. He never had to say a word. It was there in his eyes, in the smug little curl of his lip when Pa would praise him. He knew Pa's secret, and he knew that I knew, and that shared, unspoken knowledge poisoned everything. Flashback. The year is 1949. A raw, biting wind whips across the plains, rattling the window panes of the small farmhouse. Inside, a 14-year-old Ilara sits by the fire, trying to read a worn copy of Jane Eyre she'd traded a jar of her prize-winning preserves for, but her eyes keep drifting to the door. Pa and Thomas, now 16, are out in the barn, their low, serious voices a constant hum just beyond the threshold. They were always together now. Ever since that day in the woods, it was as if Pa had found not just a son, but an accomplice. A true heir. That winter was one of the coldest I can remember. The snow fell in thick, relentless blankets, burying the fences and silencing the world outside. It felt isolating, suffocating. The silence inside the house was just as heavy. Thomas had changed. He walked with a new swagger, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He no longer saw me as a sister, but as a rival who knew too much, someone to be managed, to be kept in her place. One evening, Pa was poring over some almanacs and ledgers at the kitchen table, a frown etched deep into his weathered face. Thomas stood beside him, peering over his shoulder, nodding seriously as if he understood the complex dance of crop rotation and market prices. "The blight in the south field is spreading," Pa grumbled, tapping a rough finger on the page. "If we plant potatoes there again next spring, we'll lose the whole crop." My ears perked up. I'd been watching that field for weeks, noticing the subtle yellowing of the cover crop, the way the soil seemed tired, depleted. "Pa," I said softly, closing my book. "What if we plant alfalfa instead? It would replenish the nitrogen in the soil." Mrs. Henderson's son, the one who went to the agricultural college, he was talking about it at the general store. He said, "Quiet, Alara," Pa snapped, not even looking up. "This is men's business. What would a girl who wastes her time on fanciful stories know about the land?" The words were a physical slap. Humiliation burned hot in my cheeks. I looked at Thomas, hoping for a flicker of support, a brotherly defense. Instead, he gave me a slow, condescending smirk. It was a look that said, "See? You don't belong here. This world is mine." He then turned to Pa. "She's right about one thing, Pa. The soil is tired, but I think rotating with corn would be better. Higher yield," Pa grunted, considering it. "Maybe, son, maybe." He had dismissed my idea out of hand, but he was willing to entertain the very same notion from Thomas. It wasn't about the logic of the farming. It was about who was speaking, and I, the girl, was invisible, my voice unheard. From that day on, I stopped offering suggestions. I retreated into my books, into the quiet world of chores, a silent ghost in my own home. The true test of our fractured family, however, came a few months later, when the relentless cold finally seeped through the cracks in our old farmhouse and settled deep into my mother's lungs. It started as a cough, a small rattle in her chest. But within a week, it had blossomed into a full-blown fever. Ma, my gentle, hard-working mother, was confined to her bed, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Her skin, usually smelling of flower and sunshine, now carried the sour scent of sickness. The local doctor, a grim-faced man named Miller, came once, his horse-drawn buggy struggling through the snowdrifts. He shook his head, spoke in hushed tones about pneumonia, and left a small bottle of foul-smelling elixir that did little to quell the fire in her chest. "She needs penicillin," he'd said gravely to my father. "And a hospital. I can't do more for her here." A hospital. Penicillin. He might as well have said she needed a chariot to the moon. We had no money for such things. The farm barely broke even most years. Desperation settled over our house like a shroud. Pa became a storm of frantic energy and simmering anger. He paced the floors at night, his heavy boots echoing my own frantic heartbeat. I knew what he was thinking about. The gold, the money hidden in the woods. Surely now he would use it. For Ma, for his wife. But days turned into a week, and Ma only grew weaker. I became her nurse, her shadow. I barely slept, spooning broth between her cracked lips, changing the sweat-soaked linens, placing cool cloths on her burning forehead. My hands became raw from the lye soap and boiling water, my back a constant screaming ache. I was 15, but I felt ancient. All the while, Thomas kept his distance. He'd poke his head into the sick room once a day, a look of discomfort on his face, before retreating to the warmth of the barn with Pa, to the important work that couldn't be stopped. Not even for a dying woman. The farm, the land, the inheritance, that was all that mattered. One night, the wind howled a mournful song, and Ma's breathing became so shallow I feared every exhale would be her last. I couldn't take it anymore. I found Pa in the kitchen, staring into the dying embers of the fire, his face a mask of stone. "Pa," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please, we have to do something. The money in the woods. We could use it to take her to the hospital in the city. Please." "Pa." He turned to look at me, and his eyes were cold, distant. "That money is not for this," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "That money is for the land. It's for your brother. It's to ensure this farm survives." "Survives for what?" I cried, the tears I'd been holding back for weeks finally breaking free. What good is the farm if Ma isn't here to see it? She's your wife. Do not question me, girl, he growled, rising to his full height, a menacing shadow in the flickering firelight. I know what's best. Martha is strong. She'll pull through. Now get back to her. Defeated, I stumbled back to my mother's bedside, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it stole my breath. It wasn't just my father's cruelty, but the chilling realization it brought with it. In his eyes, my mother and I were expendable. We were secondary to the land and the son who would inherit it. The gold wasn't a family safety net. It was Thomas's legacy, a legacy being purchased with my mother's life. I laid my head on the edge of her bed, my tears soaking into the worn quilt, and I prayed like I had never prayed before. Maybe it was the ferocity of my prayers, or maybe my mother was just as stubborn as my father, but slowly, miraculously, the fever began to break. She didn't die. She survived. But the illness left its mark, scarring her lungs and stealing her strength. She was never the same vibrant woman again. She became frail, a pale shadow of her former self, and a quiet, permanent sadness took root in her eyes. And I never forgave my father, or my brother, who had stood by and said nothing, his silence a deafening testament to his complicity. That spring, as the snow melted and the land came back to life, I felt as if something in me had frozen solid and would never thaw. I continued my duties, a model of quiet obedience on the surface. But underneath, a different kind of seed was being planted in my heart, a fierce, desperate need for independence. I knew I couldn't rely on my father or my brother. I couldn't rely on anyone but myself. I began to study in secret, not just the key. Novels I loved, but Pa's old ledgers. I taught myself bookkeeping, tracing the columns of figures, understanding the flow of money, the meager income, the mounting debts. I started paying closer attention to the men who came to buy our grain, listening to their talk of markets and investments. I was building an arsenal of knowledge, forging a weapon of my own in the quiet darkness of my room, long after the others were asleep. It was my only escape, my only hope. Years passed in this cold, fragile truce. I grew from a girl into a young woman. I finished my schooling, excelling in mathematics and literature, much to Pa's indifference. Thomas grew into a man who wore his heirship like a crown, becoming more and more like our father with each passing season. Ma remained a quiet presence, her love a gentle, sorrowful light in the growing darkness of our home. And then, one cool autumn evening, when I was 19, she called me to her bedside. The sickness had returned to her lungs, and this time, we all knew it would not release its grip. Her hand, when it found mine, was as thin and delicate as a bird's wing. Her voice was a reedy whisper, a final effort against the coming silence. "Ilara," she breathed, her eyes, clear and lucid, locking onto mine. "You have my fire. Don't let them put it out." I squeezed her hand, my throat tight with unshed tears. "I won't, Ma. I promise." "They see you," she continued, her breath catching. "But they don't see you. They never have. They will try to erase you, child. Erase your worth, your contribution, just like they tried to erase mine." She fumbled under her pillow, her movements weak, and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was a diary, its cover worn smooth with time, held shut by a simple leather tie. "This was my mother's," she whispered, pressing it into my hand. "And her mother's before that. The women in our line, we see things, we write them down. It holds the truth. Our truth. Don't let them take it from you. When the time is right, you'll know what to do with it. Promise me, Ilara. Promise me you'll hold on to your story." "I promise, Ma," I sobbed, clutching the small book to my chest. It felt warm, alive with the spirits of the women who had come before me. She gave me a faint, beautiful smile, a flicker of the woman she used to be. And then, with one last, gentle sigh, she was gone. The grief was a tidal wave, but the small book in my hand was an anchor. My mother's final gift, her final warning, a legacy of a different kind, not of land or of gold, but of truth. A truth I now held in my hands, its secrets still locked away, waiting. I sat there for a long time, the silence of the room pressing in on me. The worn leather of the journal a stark contrast to the cold, hard glint of the gold I knew was still, buried out in the woods. One was a legacy of greed and exclusion. The other felt like a key. But what door was it meant to unlock? Have you ever been given something precious by a loved one that held more meaning than you understood? At the time, share your story in the comments below. The truth, Grandma? What was the truth your mama wanted you to have? Marietta's question hung in the quiet, lamplit room, as delicate and earnest as she was. She had pulled my mother's old quilting, blanket around her shoulders, creating a small, cozy tent of warmth and anticipation. The story was no longer just a story for her. It was a puzzle, and she was desperate for the next piece. I smiled, a genuine if melancholy expression. "The truth, my firefly," I said, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, was that the story I had been told my whole life, the story of my father's farm and my brother's inheritance, was built on a lie. And that little leather book, it was the proof. I didn't open the journal right away. After my mother was gone, the house felt cavernous, haunted by the absence of her quiet strength. The funeral was a stark, joyless affair, the mourners' platitudes lost to the same biting wind that had characterized that long, cruel winter. Pa stood like a granite statue, his grief locked away behind a stoic mask. Thomas stood beside him, a mirror image, already practicing the role of patriarch. I felt like a stranger watching a play I had no part in. For days, I kept the journal, tucked beneath my mattress, a sacred, terrifying object. It felt like my mother's last breath, and I was afraid that by opening it, I would let her go forever. But one night, when the house was deep in slumber, and the only sound was the mournful hoot of an owl in the distance, I knew it was time. I lit a single candle, its small flame pushing back the oppressive darkness of my room, and with trembling fingers, I untied the leather cord. Flashback. Elara, 19, sits on the cold floorboards of her bedroom. The candlelight flickers across the page, illuminating the elegant faded script of a woman she'd never met, her grandmother. The ink was a sepia brown, the paper brittle with age. It didn't begin like a diary. There were no musings on the weather or neighborhood gossip. It began with numbers, dates, sums, and annotations written in a neat, precise hand. April 1922, the first entry read. Sold 3 dozen eggs to Mr. Henderson, 15 cents. Mending Mr. Abernathy's coat, 5 cents. Total saved this week, 20 cents. Page after page was filled with the same meticulous accounting. It was a shadow ledger, a secret history of the women of my family. The pennies saved from selling extra butter, the quarters earned from quilting blankets for new brides, the dollars painstakingly gathered from canning the summer's bounty and selling it at the town market. This was the egg money, the invisible economy that ran beneath the surface of the farm, unacknowledged and unseen by the men who claimed dominion over the land. As I turned the pages, my mother's handwriting, familiar and comforting, took over. The entries continued, a testament to decades of her own silent, tireless contributions. A lump formed in my throat. This book represented a river of quiet labor, of small sacrifices that, when pooled together, became a significant sum. It was their own secret cash, a testament to their resilience and foresight. But then I came to an entry that made my blood run cold. It was from my grandmother, dated the year she passed away, when my father was just a young man who had recently taken over the farm. October 1928. Gave William the entirety of my savings. 5 gold coins, $100. He says there is a man selling nuggets from the California rush, a solid investment for the farm's future. He has promised to use it for the good of the family, to build a true safety net for his children. For Thomas. And for the daughter I hope he will one day have. I pray he honors his word. I have seen a hardness in him since his father passed, a pride that worries me. I had to read it 3 times before the meaning fully sank in. The gold, Pa's secret treasure. It hadn't been his brilliant discovery, his clever investment. The seed money, the very foundation of his hidden wealth, had come from her, from my grandmother. She had entrusted him with the fruits of her life's labor, not for him to hoard, not to create a dynasty for his son, but for the whole family. He hadn't just excluded me. He had stolen my mother's inheritance, and mine along with it. The narrative of his genius, of his singular vision for the farm, was a fiction he had constructed to justify his own greed and patriarchal pride. My grief for my mother curdled into a cold, hard knot of anger. It was a clarifying rage, burning away the fog of sorrow and helplessness. They hadn't just dismissed me. They had erased the women who came before me. That night, something shifted within me. I was no longer just a grieving daughter. I was the keeper of a truth, the guardian of a stolen legacy. My secret studies took on a new urgency. This was no longer about escaping the farm. It was about understanding it, mastering the language of the world that had been denied to me. With the journal as my guide, I began my own investigation. Late at night, when Pa and Thomas were asleep, I would slip into the kitchen and light a single, low lamp. I'd pull out Pa's official farm ledgers and compare them, line by line, with the secret history I now possessed. My self-taught bookkeeping skills were finally put to the test, and what I found was staggering. My father, the man who prided himself on his connection to the land, was a terrible businessman. He was sentimental, pouring money into failing crops, because his father had always planted them. He refused to sell a barren parcel of land in the north corner because it was where he'd shot his first buck. His ledgers were filled with optimistic projections that never materialized and debts that were quietly rolled over year after year. He wasn't a shrewd steward. He was a proud, foolish man driving the farm into the ground, and my brother, his eager apprentice, was learning every one of his bad habits. The gold in the woods wasn't just a legacy for Thomas, it was a crutch. It was the secret fund Pa dipped into to cover his own mistakes, to maintain the illusion of solvency and success. Their arrogance wasn't born of competence, but of a hidden safety net they felt entitled to, a net woven by the very women they disdained. The weight of it all was crushing. I would sit there in the dead of night, the cold of the floorboards seeping into my bones, and I would feel an almost unbearable loneliness. I was the sole witness to my family's slow-motion collapse, the keeper of secrets that could shatter the fragile peace of our home. There were days I wanted to scream, to throw the ledgers at my father's feet and expose him for the fraud he was. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that they wouldn't believe me. Or if they did, they would turn on me with a fury I couldn't possibly withstand. I was a girl. My word meant nothing. I needed more than the truth. I needed power. I found it in the last few pages of my grandmother's journal. After the entry about the gold coins, there were a few pages of scattered thoughts, her handwriting growing weaker, spidery. She wrote of her fears about Pa's pride, her worries for the future, and then a final cryptic entry. He does not know of the second cache, my daughter's inheritance. Should the worst come to pass, it is hers. Let him have his gold. A woman's strength is not in metal, but in the soil she can call her own. It is safe where the morning sun first touches the hearthstone. A second. Cash. A daughter's inheritance. My heart hammered against my ribs. For days I obsessed over her words, where the morning sun first touches the hearthstone. Our hearth was massive, built of river stones, the heart of the home. But it faced west. The morning sun never touched it. I almost gave up, thinking it was a riddle I'd never solve. But then I remembered the old keeping room, a small, dusty storage space off the main kitchen that was once the original core of the farmhouse. It had a small, east-facing window and a tiny, crumbling hearth that hadn't been used in 50 years. The next morning, I woke before the roosters crow, while the sky was still a bruised purple. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent on the cold wood floors. The house was still, holding its breath in the pre-dawn quiet. In the keeping room, a single pale finger of sunlight was just beginning to creep through the grimy window pane, and it landed directly on one of the large, flat stones at the base of the old hearth. My breath caught. Holding the candle closer, I examined the stone. There was a small chip in the corner, just big enough to get my fingertips under. It was loose. My heart thundered in my ears as I worked my fingers into the gap, pulling with all my might. The stone scraped, then lifted. Nestled in the hollowed-out space beneath was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. It was surprisingly heavy. With trembling hands, I carried it back to my room and unwrapped it. Inside was not gold, but a small velvet pouch containing 20 silver dollars and a pair of delicate pearl earrings, my grandmother's. And beneath that, a folded yellow document tied with a ribbon. I carefully untied it. It was a deed. A legally registered deed to a 5-acre plot of land on the far eastern edge of our property, the part that bordered Miller's Creek. The deed was in my grandmother's name, legally bequeathed to her daughter, my mother, and now, by right of inheritance, to me. I owned a piece of the farm, my own piece. "You owned it?" Marietta whispered from her blanket nest, her eyes like saucers. "So Pa and Thomas couldn't tell you what to do anymore?" I reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear. "Oh, sweet girl, a piece of paper is a fragile thing. It's only as powerful as your ability to defend it. In that house, I had no voice, no power. Revealing the deed then would have been like a mouse showing a piece of cheese to a pair of hungry cats. They would have found a way to take it from me, to declare me crazy or incompetent. No, this secret was different. This wasn't a weapon for a fight. It was a shield, an escape route. It was the quiet knowledge that, no matter what they did, a piece of this earth belonged to me. It was a foundation I could build on, in secret. Knowing I had it changed me. It planted a seed of steel in my spine. I was no longer just waiting for my life to begin. I was planning it. I started writing letters, making inquiries. I used one of the silver dollars to secretly subscribe to a newspaper from Chicago, devouring news of the world beyond our dusty fields. I was gathering my strength, waiting for the right moment, and I didn't have to wait long. The farm was failing, faster than even I had realized. A series of bad harvests, coupled with Pa's poor decisions, had pushed us to the brink. The bank started sending letters, their tone growing more severe with each one. A man in a suit came to visit, speaking in low, urgent tones about foreclosure. The air in the house grew thick with a tension so palpable you could taste it. Pa retreated into a stony silence, his pride preventing him from admitting the depth of his failure. Thomas, however, reacted with a desperate, reckless arrogance. He was determined to prove himself the savior of the family legacy. One evening, he burst into the house, his face flushed with excitement. He unrolled a map of the property on the kitchen table, which was still littered with the remnants of our meager supper. "Pa, I've got it," he declared, his voice booming with false confidence. "I found the solution. Henderson has always wanted access to Miller's Creek for his cattle. He'll pay a premium for it. We can sell off this useless patch of scrubland over here. It's no good for planting anyway. The money would be enough to pay off the bank and get us through the winter." He stabbed a finger at the map. My body went rigid, the blood draining from my face. From across the room, I could see exactly where his finger was pointing. He was pointing to my land. "So you just stood there, Grandma? You let them think they were going to sell your land?" Marietta's voice was filled with a child's pure, uncomplicated indignation. She had sat up straight, the cozy blanket forgotten in a heap around her. Waste. To her, the path was simple. I had the proof, so I should have used it, like a sword. I managed a faint smile, reaching out to smooth the wrinkled blanket over her knees. "It's not so simple, my firefly. Sometimes, the most powerful words are the ones you hold back just for a moment." In that kitchen, watching them, I felt frozen. The world narrowed to that worn map on the table, to my brother's triumphant finger pointing at the one thing on this earth that was truly mine. His voice, so full of unearned confidence, was just a buzzing in my ears. I wasn't a participant anymore. I was a spectator to my own erasure. Flashback, the year is 1955. Alara, now 20, stands in the shadows of the doorway, watching her father and brother. The dim kerosene lamp casts long, dancing shadows, making them look like giants, their authority absolute. Pa, his face a mask of grim relief, clapped Thomas on the shoulder. It was a gesture of finality, of succession. The decision was made. "See to it first thing in the morning, son," Pa said, his voice gravelly with exhaustion and something that sounded perilously like hope. "Get Henderson to sign the papers. This will see us through." He finally looked over at me, his eyes glossing. Over me, as if I were a part of the wallpaper. "Alara, clean up this mess." He meant the supper dishes, but it felt like he meant the entirety of his failed legacy. Thomas gave me a fleeting, triumphant glance before turning to leave, already dreaming. I was sure of his role as the farm's savior. They left me there in the silent kitchen with the map of my own dispossession lying on the table. That night, sleep was an impossibility. I sat on the edge of my bed, the small, stiff deed in one hand and my grandmother's journal in the other. The house groaned around me, each creak and sigh of the old wood sounding like a whispered accusation. The air was thick and still, the kind of heavy quiet that comes before a storm. My mind was a whirlwind. One path was clear, simple even. I could let them sell the land. The deal would be done, the money would go to the bank, and they would never be the wiser. I had my own small cache of money from my grandmother. I could pack a bag, walk to the bus station in town, and disappear. I could go to Chicago, or St. Louis, or anywhere, and start a new life, free from the suffocating weight of my family's history. It would be an escape. It would be freedom. But my mother's face kept swimming before my eyes. Her promise. Don't let them erase you. Running felt like the ultimate erasure. It would mean letting their version of the story, the one where I was a footnote, a ghost in the background, become the only one. It would mean my mother's and grandmother's silent sacrifices would be for nothing, their legacy squandered, by the very men they had worked to support. Their river of effort would simply sink into the dry, cracked earth of my father's pride. My fingers tightened around the journal, and a memory, sharp and painful, pierced through my turmoil. Intense flashback. It was a few years prior, after Ma's first terrible bout of pneumonia. She was still so weak, a pale, fragile version of herself. One evening, she was sitting by the fire, her hands gnarled with arthritis and trembling with fatigue, working to mend a tear in one of Thomas's work shirts. The needlework was clumsy, the stitches uneven, but she was determined. It was one of the few chores she could still manage, a way for her to feel useful, to contribute. Thomas came in from the barn, cold and impatient. He saw her struggling, the needle slipping through her fingers. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Ma," he'd said, not cruelly, but with the thoughtless condescension he had learned from Pa. He snatched the shirt from her hands. "Just give it here. I'll do it later. It'll be faster. He hadn't seen the flicker of pain in her eyes, the way her hands fell limply into her lap, defeated. He hadn't understood that he had taken more than a shirt from her. He had taken a piece of her purpose. He had, in his haste, rendered her invisible, irrelevant. She had just wanted to offer him an act of love, and he had seen only an inconvenience. That memory was the spark that lit the fuse. My decision, when it came, was not born of logic, but of a deep, primal need to honor that flicker of pain in my mother's eyes. This was not just about 5 acres of scrubland. It was about making them. See me, see my mother, see the generations of women whose silent labor had held that farm together. I would not run. I would not be erased. I would demand my place at the table they had built with my inheritance. The next morning, the sky was a bruised, angry gray, and a fine, miserable drizzle was falling. It matched my mood perfectly. I dressed with care, not in my usual worn farm dress, but in my best church dress, a simple navy blue frock my mother had made for me years ago. I brushed my hair until it shone, pulling it back in a severe adult knot at the nape of my neck. I was preparing for battle. I walked into the kitchen. Thomas was pulling on his boots, ready to ride into town. Pa was at the table, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands, the map still spread out before him like a proclamation of victory. They both looked up as I entered, a flicker of surprise on their faces at my appearance. I didn't say a word. I walked. To the table, my heart a cold, steady drum against my ribs, and I placed the deed directly on top of the map, covering the section of land they intended to sell. "You can't sell that land," I said. My voice was quiet, devoid of the emotion that was raging inside me. It was as calm and flat as the gray sky outside. Thomas let out a short, incredulous laugh. "What are you talking about, Ilara? Don't be dramatic." "That land," I said, tapping a single finger on the deed, "is not yours to sell. It's mine." The silence that followed was absolute. Pa stared at the document, his brow furrowed in confusion. Thomas just looked at me as if I'd grown a second head. "What? Is this nonsense?" Pa finally growled, snatching the deed from the table. His eyes scanned the legal language, his face shifting from confusion to disbelief, and then to a dark, simmering fury. "Where did you get this? This is a forgery. Did you steal this?" "It was my grandmother's," I replied, my voice unwavering. "She left it to my mother, and now it is mine. It is all perfectly legal." "Legal?" Thomas spat, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "You've been hiding this? Scheming behind our backs? For what? To ruin us?" The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The injustice of it, the sheer blind arrogance, broke through my carefully constructed calm. "Ruin you?" I asked, my voice rising, finally cracking with the weight of a lifetime of suppressed age. "You speak to me of ruin? You who have been driving this farm into the ground for years out of sheer stubborn pride? You who would have let your own wife die rather than touch the money that my grandmother gave you." That struck home. Pa flinched as if I'd physically hit him. "You don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his authority crumbling. "Oh, I think I do," I said, and with that, I placed the small, worn leather journal on the table beside the deed. This was hers, too, and my mother's. It's their story, a story of every penny they ever saved, every sacrifice they ever made. A story you have conveniently forgotten. My hands were shaking, but my voice was strong. I opened the journal to the marked page. I read aloud my grandmother's entry about the 5 gold coins, her words echoing across the silent kitchen, a voice from the grave testifying to his betrayal. I didn't stop there. I told them everything. I told them about my secret studies of the ledgers, of the bad deals, the mounting debts, the slow, steady collapse they had hidden from the world, and from themselves. I laid the truth of our family bare on that worn wooden table, stripping away decades of lies and self-deception. When I finished, the silence was different. It was not the quiet of shock, but the hollow, echoing silence of utter devastation. My father had slumped in his chair, looking, for the first time in his life, like a frail old man. All the hardness, all the unyielding pride had been sandblasted away, leaving behind something raw and broken. Thomas stood motionless, his face pale, his eyes wide with the dawning horror of a man whose entire world has just been proven a lie. The legacy he had been promised, the very foundation of his identity, had crumbled to dust in the space of a few minutes. He was the first to speak, his voice a choked whisper. "What do you want, Alara? What's the point of all this? To destroy us? To watch us lose everything?" I looked at their shattered faces, and I felt not triumph, but a profound and aching sadness. Vengeance would have been easy, but vengeance would not honor my mother. "No," I said softly, the fight draining out of me, replaced by a weary resolve. "I don't want to destroy the farm. I want to save it. But we will not save it your way. We will not sell one more inch of this land." I took a deep breath. "This is my offer. I have the money my grandmother left me. It's not much, but it's enough. To pay the immediate interest to the bank, to buy us some time. I will give it to you for the farm. But in return, I am done being silent. I am done being invisible. From now on, I manage the books, all of them. I will decide what we plant, what we sell, what debts get paid. You will work the land, Pa, and you, Thomas. But the financial decisions, they will be mine. We will be partners. Or you can refuse, and we can all watch the bank take everything." It was an unthinkable proposition, a complete upending of the natural order as they knew it. I was a 20-year-old girl, and I was demanding control of their world. I expected them to rage, to refuse, to throw me out. But my father just sat there, his eyes vacant, all the fight gone out of him. He slowly, almost imperceptibly, nodded. Thomas stared at me, his expression a chaotic mix of hatred, grudging respect, and utter desperation. He knew I was right. He knew they had no other choice. "Fine," he bit out, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. "Partners." "Grandma?" Marietta's voice was full of awe. She was clinging to my arm, her small fingers digging into my sleeve. "You did it. You were so brave. Weren't you terrified?" I looked down at her sweet, earnest face and pulled her into a hug, breathing in the scent of her clean hair. "Terrified, my love," I whispered into her hair. "Bravery isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what you have to do anyway." That morning, I had to choose. I could stay a ghost in my own life, or I could demand to be seen. I chose to be seen. The victory, if you could call it that, didn't feel sweet. It felt heavy. The family I had grown up with, for all its flaws, had been shattered on that kitchen table. In its place was something new, fragile, and deeply uncertain. "So you all work together?" Marietta asked, pulling back to look at me. "And you saved the farm?" I nodded slowly. "We did." They agreed, and for a while, it almost worked. I took over the finances, and with a ruthless pragmatism they had never possessed, I began to pull us back from the brink. It was a new beginning, of a sort. But a foundation built on shattered trust is a fragile thing, my firefly. The quiet in that house wasn't peace. It was just a lull in the storm. I had won the battle, but I had made an enemy of my brother. And I had severely underestimated the depths of his resentment. The worst betrayal, the one that would finally drive me from that land forever, was yet to come. "But what could be worse, Grandma?" Marietta's voice was a fragile thread in the deepening twilight of the room. The story had taken hold of her completely. She was no longer just a listener. She was living it with me, her small face reflecting all the indignation and sorrow of the past. What could be worse than everything they'd already done? I took a sip of my now lukewarm chamomile tea, the familiar taste a small comfort. I looked at my granddaughter, her heart so full of pure, uncomplicated justice, and I felt a pang of sadness for the lesson I was about to teach her. "The most dangerous betrayals, my firefly," I began, my voice heavy with the memory, "are the ones that come after a moment of hope. They are the ones that let you believe things can be different, that let you lower your guard just before they strike the final blow." After that terrible morning in the kitchen, a strange and fragile peace settled over the farm. It was not a warm peace, not the peace of a healed family, but the cold, quiet peace of a ceasefire. On the surface, our arrangement worked. I took to the ledgers like a duck to water. The messy, prideful accounting of my father was replaced by my meticulous, pragmatic system. I found new buyers for our grain who paid better prices. I argued with the bank and renegotiated our debt into manageable payments. I sold off the old, failing equipment Pa had clung to for sentimental reasons, and, with a small portion of my own secret inheritance, made a down payment on a newer, more efficient tractor. Slowly, painstakingly, we began to climb out of the hole my father had dug. The farm began to breathe again. Pa was a ghost of the man he'd once been. The fight had gone out of him completely. He did as I asked, his movements slow and mechanical, his eyes holding a permanent, haunted look. He was a king who had been deposed in his own kingdom, and he didn't know how to be anything else. In a way, I pitied him. Thomas was another matter entirely. He was a coiled spring of resentment. He worked the land with a furious, sullen energy, his silence more menacing than any argument. He followed my plans, but I could feel his eyes on me at the dinner table, across the barnyard, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. I had taken his birthright. I had exposed his and our father's incompetence. I had stolen his identity as the heir and savior of the farm. In his eyes, I was not a partner. I was a usurper, a witch who had bewitched his father and stolen his future. Still, a foolish, stubborn part of me began to hope. I saw the farm healing, the fields growing stronger under my care, and I thought, perhaps our family could heal too. I thought that by saving the land we all loved, I could somehow save us. I poured everything I had into that hope. I worked from sunrise to long after sunset, my mind consumed with crop yields and market futures, my hands stained with both ink and soil. I was building a future, and I truly believed, for a short, naive time, that it could be our future. The sea. Serpent in our fragile Eden arrived in a crisp white envelope about 2 years into our tense partnership. It was a letter from a large agricultural conglomerate, a company that had been buying up small family farms across the state. They were making an offer for our property, and it was a staggering amount of money, far more than the farm was actually worth. It was enough for my father and brother to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. I read the letter, and my blood ran cold. It was a devil's bargain. To accept would mean giving up our home, our history, 100 years of our families, sweat and toil, to be swallowed by a faceless corporation. It would be the end of our story. I took the letter to my father. "We have to refuse," I said simply, laying it on the table. "We're finally solvent. The farm has a future. This money, it's a poison pill." Pa read the letter, his hand trembling, slightly. He looked out the window at the fields, the setting sun turning them to gold. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the man he used to be, the man who loved this land more than his own family. "You're right, Alara," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is our home. It's not for sale." Relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me weak in the knees. We were united. We had chosen our legacy over easy money, but I had forgotten about Thomas. I had forgotten the depths of his resentment, the way it had been festering in the darkness for 2 long years. For me, saving the farm was a victory. For him, it was a daily humiliation. Every successful harvest under my management was another testament to his failure. The corporate offer wasn't a poison pill to him. It was a golden key. It was his escape. It was his chance to reclaim his masculinity with a fistful of cash, to be free of the sister who had emasculated him, to finally be the man with the money, the man in charge. He went to our father that night, after I had gone to bed. I don't know exactly what he said, but I can imagine it. He would have preyed on Pa's weakness, on his broken pride. He would have painted me as a tyrant, a spinster who would keep them both under her thumb for the rest of their lives. He would have whispered that selling was the only way for Pa to be a man again, to make his own decision, to provide for his son. He held up the promise of a life of ease against the reality of a life of hard work under the command of his daughter. It was the final, most devastating betrayal. My father, the man who had just agreed with me, the man who had watched me save his life's work, allowed his weak, wounded pride to be manipulated by his son. He chose the past over the future. He chose his son's ego over his daughter's competence. He reverted to the old, familiar order of things. The next morning, they were waiting for me in the kitchen, not with anger, but with a chilling, united front. A document from the corporation was on the table, signed in my father's shaky hand, and Thomas's bold, arrogant scrawl. "It's done, Alara," Thomas said, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. "We've accepted the offer. The farm is sold." I stared at the signatures, the world tilting on its axis. "But, Pa, you said, we agreed. A man has a right to provide for his son," Pa mumbled, unable to look me in the eye. "Thomas is right. This is for the best." They had gone behind my back and sold everything: my home, my mother's memory, my grandmother's legacy, and my land. My own 5 acres, which they had cleverly absorbed into the sale by arguing that my investments and partnership role had legally merged my assets with the family property. They had used my own hard work against me. Then came the final, cruelest cut. Thomas slid a check across the table. It was for a few $100s. "This is your share," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "For your troubles. A share. Not the portion of an owner, not the return on an investment, but a pittance, a pat on the head for the little girl who had helped out. After everything, after saving them, they still saw me as nothing. In that moment, I finally understood. I could never win. I could never make them see me, because their world was built on the necessity of my invisibility. Something inside me didn't break. It simply went still. The rage, the grief, the desperate need for their approval, it all vanished, replaced by a vast, empty calm. I looked at the 2 of them, my father, a broken man propped up by his son's greed, and my brother, a hollow man puffing himself up with a victory he hadn't earned. And I felt nothing but a profound, bottomless pity. I pushed the check back across the table. "I don't want your money," I said, my voice as quiet as the grave. "I wanted a family." I turned and walked out of the kitchen, up to my room. I didn't pack much. My few good dresses, my mother's quilt, my grandmother's pearl earrings, and the journal. I walked back downstairs, past the 2 silent men at the table, and out the front door. I didn't look back. I walked down the long, dusty lane, the land of my ancestors on either side of me, and I did not shed a single tear. The tears would come later. For now, there was only the strange, light-headed feeling of being utterly, terrifyingly free. I took a bus heading west. I had no plan, no destination, only a vague notion of California, the land of gold, the place that had started my family's story of secrets. I decided I would start my own story there. I arrived in California with my small bag and my even smaller inheritance from my grandmother. I found a job as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company. The skills I had honed saving my family's farm made me exceptionally good at it. I lived in a tiny apartment, saved every penny, and for the first time in my life, I felt the peace of being the sole author of my own destiny. But there is one final piece to the story, my firefly. Before I left the Midwest, I did one last thing. I had taken my grandmother's journal and my deed to the county seat and met with the lawyer her journal had mentioned, a distant cousin. He was an old, kind man who remembered my grandmother. I told him the whole story. He reviewed my deed and the old survey maps, and he found something remarkable. My little 5-acre plot, which my father and brother had dismissed as useless, scrubland, sat atop a significant deposit of quartz, and its access to Miller's Creek gave it riparian rights that were incredibly valuable. The Agricultural Corporation hadn't just wanted the farm, they had desperately wanted my plot of land. The lawyer, acting on my behalf, filed a claim against the sale. I was not seeking to overturn it, I just wanted what was legally mine. When the corporation began their mining and water diversion operations, a long and complicated legal battle ensued. But my claim, thanks to my grandmother's foresight, was ironclad. Years later, I was awarded a massive settlement and ongoing royalties. It was a fortune I had never expected. The land, in the end, had honored the women who had truly loved it. Never told my father or brother. Their story ended with the sale of the farm. I heard Pa passed away a few years later, and Thomas squandered most of the money on bad investments, trying to prove he was the businessman he never was. Theirs was a story of pride and ruin. Mine was just beginning. I used the money not for revenge or extravagance, but for life. I finally put myself through college, studying business and history. I invested wisely. I built a life of quiet comfort and security. And I raised a son, David, your uncle, determined to give him the unconditional love and support I had never known. I pulled myself back to the present, back to the warm, lamplit room and the precious weight of my granddaughter. In my arms, her face was wet with tears. "But it's not fair, Grandma," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "After all that, Uncle David, he does the same thing. He leaves you out." I hugged her tight, stroking her hair. "Oh, my sweet girl," I said, my own voice finally catching. "That is the echo, the final lesson. When my son sent me that text message, it hurt. It cut me to the core. But as I sat with the pain, I realized something. The pain wasn't just about a missed family dinner. It was the echo of my father's dismissal, of my brother's betrayal. My son married a woman who, for her own reasons, feels the need to control the family, to make it smaller, to push me to the margins. It is the same pattern, the same attempt to erase me. I held her face in my hands. But here is the most important part of the whole story. This time, it's different. I am no longer that scared girl in the farmhouse. Their choice does not get to define my worth. My happiness is not in their hands. My father and brother sold the land, but they could not sell my spirit. My son and his wife can uninvite me to dinner, but they cannot take away my peace. I looked around my cozy home, at the photos on the mantelpiece, of my travels, my graduation, of a younger me holding a baby Marietta. True wealth, my love, was never the gold or the money. It's the knowing, deep in your bones, that you are enough. True family is not about blood. It's about the people who see you, who choose you, who love you not for what you can do for them, but for exactly who you are. You, my firefly, you are my true inheritance. You are my legacy. With a sense of ceremony, I reached over to the bookshelf and took down the old, worn leather journal. I placed it gently in her small hands. "This is your story now," I whispered. "It's the story of the strong women you come from. Women who were silenced, who were erased, but who held onto the truth and passed it down like a secret fire. Now it is yours to keep. Remember them, and more importantly, always, always remember your own worth. Marietta clutched the book to her chest, her tears finally stopping. She looked from the journal to me, her eyes shining with a new understanding. In her gaze, I saw the fire of my mother and the resilience of my grandmother. The line was unbroken. My story was safe. And in the quiet love of that room, I had found the one thing I had been searching for my entire life. I was finally home. What does family truly mean to you? Who are the people who make you feel seen and loved? Share your story of resilience and hope in the comments below. Let's celebrate the legacies of love that truly matter.